Welcome to the Dad Lit Pod, the literary podcast for people who are annoyed to find that someone didn't roll up the garden hose after they used it. Today's guest is Craig Terlson. Craig Terlson's fiction has appeared in Lit Hub, Mystery Weekly, Carve, Hobart, Smoke Long Quarterly, Bound Off, 3 a.m., Slow Trains Literary, and many other literary journals in the United States, United Kingdom, and South Africa. He's the author of four novels, a novella, and a short story collection, including Bluegrass Samurai and the Luke Fisher crime novel series. His work creates bridges between literary fiction, crime fiction, and at times slipstream or magical realism. Throughout his writing, he brings a quirky, dark sense of humor and an ear for the dialogue he heard growing up on the Canadian prairies. His prose possesses a cinematic quality and an eye for detail stemming from his years as a professional illustrator. Thank you, Craig, for joining me for this episode of the Dadlit Pod.
So good to finally make it. This is episode 300, is it? Or 400?
Just, maybe four.
400?
Let's go
Okay.
with four.
Like a
400 of
big
the
archive
Dadlit
to go
Pod.
through. I don't know. Yeah.
So the tough thing about this conversation is going to be to refer to you as Craig, which I know is much more helpful from a book selling perspective than what I'm going to naturally want to do, which is call you Turley.
And that is fine. That is completely fine. When you first call me that, and can I call you, do I have to call you Mr. Roberts?
No, you can call me Dan
Okay, I'll go down then.
or Daniel.
I think Mr. Roberts was a movie with Henry Fonda or something. But
Yes.
uh, when you first called me that, it kind of took me back because that was one of my main nicknames in high school. And so when anyone calls me Turley, it's like, oh, I know you from my Saskatchewan small town, right? So when you called, I was like, what? Like, do I know Dan? What? How do you know that? How do you know that? So yeah, you can call me whatever you want. I love the idea of this podcast because I'm such a dad. I'm a dad to three children, and now I'm a granddad to four grandchildren. And Dad Lit. I just wanted to say that like I was part of a men's book club for a bunch of years, like
Yes.
15 years that I started, and people used to make fun of us. They go, well, what are men gonna read? What are dads gonna read? You're gonna read the Canadian Tire flyer, you're going to read the catalog, whatever, and I always defend it. We read a lot of literary stuff. There's a lot of literary dads out there, and I'm one of them. So yeah, I mean, I love talking about dad lit because dad lit is universal.
It is indeed. What would you say is quintessential dad lit for you?
Oh,
Having been
gee.
in a 15-year, effectively a dad lit literary
It
circle.
was a dad literary. Dads like to gravitate towards the classics. We had to read Moby Dick. That was just had to be a thing, right? But it seems like we almost never read crime fiction, which is kind of funny because crime fiction lands on a lot of dad lit type
Oh
lists.
yeah, a lot.
But we did a lot of, it was kind of weird. We had different people. We read some political stuff. We didn't read just fiction, So again, it was pretty expansive, but we had to. I just want to say I don't have to remind myself that there's many incredible authors of different genres because sometimes they go, "Did you read any women authors?" Of course we did.
Yeah.
We read lots. There's an amazing Alice Munro and whoever. Like so, look for me, writing is writing kind of thing. So yeah, yeah. I don't know.
Well, I got asked this question, which is, would I have a female author on the Dadlit podcast? And I said, of course, because there are some female authors that write Dadlit.
Yep.
And I think specifically the person I'd love to talk to because I love the TV show is the woman who wrote Fleischman is in Trouble,
Oh.
which is a sort of book about a divorce
Hmm.
told from the perspective of a dad and a female friend watching the divorce go down.
Wow.
And it's very interesting. It was a show with Claire Danes and Jesse
Huh?
Eisenberg, who just recently produced that really terrific movie that won the Oscar, A Real Pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I would love to do that because I think that there's so many good books about out there that would be attractive to dads of all types. As I originally conceived it, the idea of dad lit sort of sprung from two places, which are my uncle, who reads Tom Clancy books and his Air Force Times. And I said, well, if there's a dad lit, gold standard, it
Yeah, gold
is
standard
yeah,
Clancy.
it is
Totally.
Tom Clancy and the
Yeah,
Air Force Times.
totally. So what I go back to, so it's Fleischman in Trouble. I've heard of it. That's what it's
Yeah,
called.
yeah, Fleischman's in trouble.
So I love genre busting, and if you look at my writing career, it's a genre busting. I've been told that I can't stay in my own lane, and it's true. I can't. I hate it. There's too many stories I want to tell to stay in one thing. So you talk about people like Megan Abbott. Megan Abbott took crime fiction and turned it on its head. Turned it on its head by talking about the femme fatale in a whole bunch of wholly different way through her lens. And you kind of go, is that dad lit? I don't know, but it's sort of like it fits into that genre.
Mhm.
And I started off totally as a literary writer. Like George Saunders, who's another huge writing hero of mine, George Saunders said he had a Hemingway boner for years that he had to get over. I also possessed a Hemingway boner that I had to get over, and a Faulkner boner, and a whole bunch of those classics, right?
Yeah.
And I started writing really mostly literary stuff, and I fell in love with magical realism from
Mhm.
Marquez, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Allende, the person who wrote like Water for Chocolate, just amazing, and it really mystified me. And so I went down that path with my first novel called Correction Line, and Correction Line was a novel that was a literary crime fiction slipstream novel. And again, stay in your own lane. Why did I know this? Because I had an agent at the time, a really well placed agent, who's now passed. His name was Michael Choate or Mickey Choate. I always like to say my agent's name was Mickey Choate because he sounded like he was from Long Island, and he was from Long Island. And Mickey actually was really well placed in that he represented Joe Hill. And Joe Hill, as some of our many, many millions of listeners know, was Stephen King's kid,
Yeah.
right? And so when Joe Hill came out as Joe Hill King, his books became very, very popular. What does this mean? That Mickey Choate had a direct line to many top editors, and he started
Yeah.
showing Correction Line around. And Correction Line had mystical stuff in it, had crime stuff in it, and had literary stuff. And right from the beginning, he said, "You're going to have a hard time selling this book." And he was completely right because
Yeah.
I couldn't stay in my lane. They didn't know where to put it. And so, getting to how I ended up writing crime fiction, I always tell people I ended up writing crime fiction accidentally. I didn't read that much. As a teenager, I read a lot of Donald Westlake because I thought it was funny. And that was the only one I read, and I just thought he was hilarious. And, but I never read, people would talk about these classic crime fiction, never heard of them. And I wrote after, I'm not going to get into the whole long tale of rejection because everyone knows that as a writer.
Yeah.
Um, I began to lose uh, the reason for writing. That is that I love doing it and I stopped having fun and it just sucked because I was just hating it. And so I said, what if I create a character who is like the people that I really love, like 1970s neo noir, crime fiction, um, Elliot Gould in Altman's Long Goodbye,
Mhm.
that kind of stuff, right? Um, Travis McGee, who I'd heard of, hadn't read much at the time. Travis McGee from John D. McDonald. I wanted that vibe, and I wanted it to be fun. And so I started this guy just out of the ether, Luke Fisher. Just started one day just writing Luke Fisher, and became this thing. And now those books sell way more than any of my other books. And I love
Mhm.
writing it, but I wasn't a crime fiction author because then people would say, "Hey, have you read Charles Willeford?" And I go, "Nope." Have you read
Mhm.
James Lee Burke? Nope. And now I've read all those guys and some great. from both, not just both, sorry, I'm a multi-genre guy, multi-gender guy too. There's all kinds of great stuff that now I'm getting schooled in. So I don't know, I'm jumping ahead, but that's, you mentioned the Luke Fisher stuff, so I wanted to dive into that a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. I find that I am not constrained with a specific genre desire to live in that. I think most of um, my works, as I end up writing them, they almost all end in a Western style, which is with a face-off,
Love it.
and they all tend to have elements of male despair and the sort of pain of duty. But
Mm.
if it shows up in horror, crime, or just sci-fi, they all seem to have that underlying element to it. And I thought that was interesting. I was wondering, is there anything that would, as you're writing, you just find that shows through when, Turley puts together a book that at the end of it, you're like, oh, upon reflection, I do a lot of this.
Well, I'm a big fan of male despair. Um,
Who is it?
who is it, right? I mean, one of my guys, I get into these people really, really deeply. I read every word that Vonnegut wrote for years
Yeah.
and years. And then I read every word that Don DeLillo wrote because, talking about masters of male despair. But, as you've gotten to know me, I have this kind of sense of humor that I find the humor in a lot of things. My son is actually a professional. He's a comic writer, and I love humor and I love dark humor. And so that kind of marriage of despair and humor kind of keeps bubbling up. And you mentioned, and I'll say you got the name wrong, but everyone does, including my editor. It's
Yeah.
actually, what is it? Samurai Bluegrass.
Samurai Bluegrass.
No,
Yeah.
Bluegrass Samurai. When I first got the edits back, the first page it said Bluegrass Samurai. I had to tell the editor that's not actually not the title. Maybe you think that's the title, but it's the other way. So it's a return back to that mystical kind of stuff that I started with. There's some magic realism in that, some time travel in that kind of thing. And to join that up, what I've discovered quite recently, what I'm writing about is hidden truth. I'm
Hmm.
really fascinated by stuff that's hidden and bubbles up, and it shows up in crime fiction. It shows up in all kinds of fiction where it's like, what is the truth? Because one of the
Yeah.
novels that we didn't talk about in your list there, that I'm going to be re-releasing, is the novel called Fall in One Day. And Fall in One Day takes place in 1973 during Watergate, and you hear again that hidden truth thing. And I love that about crime fiction. It's always like what gets revealed. And every book I'm writing seems to bubble up again. Oh, this is what gets revealed and who's lying to who. So that's all sort of like that sounds maybe disparate, but the idea of black humor, male despair, and hidden truth. Those are my blurbs in my next book.
Yes, there you
You
go.
know?
So, did you start writing before you became a dad or after you became a dad?
Oh man, that's the best question ever. Um, I remember the weekend I started really writing
Yeah.
because as a kid, I always wanted to be an author. As a 2-year-old, I think I told my parents, I want to be an author. Very pretentious. Didn't say writer or something, said author. And then I got involved in a whole bunch of stuff. I was a musician and illustrator, designer, all that kind of stuff like that. And I always thought that I returned to writing. Um, and one fateful weekend, and I know the exact weekend it was because it was the weekend that Lady Diana died in that horrible crash. There was a press in Western Canada called Anvil Press that used to run the 3-day novel contest. And you literally had 3 days to write a novel. Now, the novels are not that long, they come out
Yeah.
30, 40,000 words. And I said, well, shit, I got no time for this. I'm a dad. I've got a whole bunch of little children and stuff. Because I was a very young dad. I had 3 kids by the time I was 29. And so I said, I don't have time for this. So my wife, who is just the most lovely supporter, I said, could you take the kids and just go away for 3 days? I want to see if I can do this. Can I do this? Can I do this? Right. So they said, sure. She was great. She left. She went to Saskatchewan, where people go when they got to get out of town. And I wrote for 12, 14, 15 hours a day. I couldn't even imagine doing that now. My
Yeah.
brain was so empty at the end of 3 days, and I had a novel called 3 Days West. It's not a very good novel. I don't even know where it is. But so it was sort of while I was a dad, I got this bug. I said, I think I can finally do this. And then it came around again the next year, the 3 day contest. And again, I said to my wife, could you take the kids and go blah, blah, blah. And she said to me, and I'll never forget, she goes, why don't you try writing a real novel? Oh, burn. And I said, okay, okay. So then I started. That's really when I started. So, yeah. And my grandkids now too, I love it. I'm very close to my grandkids, especially my granddaughter. Um, and she knows in the morning before work that I have a cup of coffee and then I have to leave to go upstairs. And she told me, you're writing the Great Canadian Novel. I go, yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's 11, right? It's great. So it's fun I'm a total dad. I have kids in my life all the time, and kids, unfortunately, they're too young to read my crime fiction
Yeah.
because it's got like bad words in it and smoking and drinking and fighting, you know,
Yeah, the good stuff.
the good stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, dad stuff.
the dad stuff.
So, would you say what is because the Great American Novel comes up a lot.
Yeah.
What would define the Great Canadian Novel if you were working on it?
Yeah, there'd have to be a lot of maple syrup.
There'd have to be a ton of maple syrup.
Maple syrup pancakes, some
Yes.
yeast.
This is an interesting question because it comes up, believe it or not, Canada is in the news occasionally.
I've heard
Uh,
that. Something about
yes.
us becoming one of you
Yes.
guys. Yeah.
So what is the sort of cultural vision of the Canadian literary world? What would go into a great Canadian novel?
Oh man. Okay. Okay. We're gonna get into it then. I'm hoping none of my Canadian friends are listening to this podcast because I'm gonna throw down some shit. I don't know if you can say that in your podcast. Sorry for
Yeah,
fucking
fine.
swearing. But okay. So Great Canadian Novel, Great American Novel, two very different things.
Very different.
Um, my books, and I'll say in order, this will all make sense. My books are sold first in the US, second in the UK, third is probably Australia or Germany, somewhere like that. Hanging around at the bottom is Canada. I don't
Hmm.
sell a lot in Canada. I'm actually more well known in other countries. And I figured out it's because I'm not writing the Great Canadian Novel. I read a lot of Americans, I read a lot of Canadians too, and there's many, many great Canadian novels that are just amazing. But someone told me once that a great Canadian novel is a book that's good for you, right?
Oh
It
no,
makes
like
you,
Degrassi High, but like a book.
well, yeah, and Degrassi High, but yeah, but like with vegetables and vitamins, and it's going to make you maple
It's
leaves,
gonna.
and you're going to be proud. It's not even like this thing you're talking about that I've heard a little bit about, something about the
Yeah.
51st state, is enlightening or lighting up this kind of patriotism in Canada that you don't usually see. You really don't see it. We're not a bunch
Yeah.
of flag wavers, but we are pissed off and we're starting to wave flags around. But it's sort of like there's this humbleness that, like, the Great Canadian Novel is like, oh, it's all these truths in it, and they're very deep and they're poetic and they're like very literary, and it's like, this is what it means to be human and stuff like that. And I go, oh man, that just sounds kind of boring.
Yeah. I'm
And
gonna
can
be
we
honest.
have
That sounds
some
incredibly
drinking and some
boring.
fighting and some shooting? So it's kind of funny because and that's the some Canadian novelists will be really pissed off that I said that. I'm sorry. But sorry to all the Canadian novelists listening to this. But the thing is that there's a great Canadian novelist now gone, Mordecai Richler. Mordecai Richler was an amazing novelist who just told amazing stories. They're literary, they're incredible stories. Margaret Atwood is an incredible novelist.
Hmm.
What she writes is so good, but they're really rooted in story. And sometimes when you look and my agent at the time told me this, the Canadian bestseller list looks very different than the American bestseller list. The Canadian bestseller list is much more literary than the American bestseller list. You're not going to see, the Clancy's up top, or even, Stephen King straddles it, but Stephen King's up there too. You're going to see a lot of literary stuff on the Canadian bestseller list. Now, the weirdness of what I do is I'm trying to be literary, not on purpose,
Hmm.
but if you read enough Faulkner and DeLillo and Don Quixote and stuff like that, the literary
Yeah,
is
the style comes
it's
through.
going to sneak in. It's going to
Yep.
sneak in, right? And some people have called my crime fiction more literary. I think Samurai Bluegrass is a more literary novel, but it's
Hmm.
always rooted in story. And that sounds like bullshit because literary novels should be rooted in story as well. But it's sort of like I'll close with this observation that I made. I was Richard Ford was a hero of mine in the past till I found out he's an asshole because he's like a really amazing writer, but he's got some stuff that he's done that's very I don't agree with. But he
Yep.
was still like a major just hero of mine. And he writes a book called Canada, which is a great book. And he writes most of it takes place in Canada. And I'm reading and I'm going, oh, this is an American writing what Canada's like. And it's very different, very different. And then one of our best novelists and short story writers, Guy Vanderhaeg, who's won the Governor General Award, big award up here numerous times, he wrote a book that took place kind of in Montana, was his kind of
Yep.
area, right? And some of the Canadian border. I was like, oh, this is a Canadian writing about what it's like to be an American.
Hmm.
And I do find sometimes a bit of an imposter because my stories take place in Michigan, in New Mexico, in Montana, all these places
Hmm.
that I love. And I hope no one finds out I'm Canadian because it's sort of,
Yeah.
Samurai was my first book that I set really like in Toronto because it had to be in
Yes.
Toronto. All my other books, I'm Mexico and the States, and eventually I get to Canada.
Yeah, I was talking to a mutual friend, Thomas Trang,
Who is a hack?
and he and I were talking, and I was saying to him because obviously he lives in Britain, and he did quite a good job with his book and with capturing the
Right?
American voice
Oh yeah.
for a guy who grew up in Australia and lives in England. And I said I conceptualized a story that I wanted to write, but the main character would be British.
Mm.
And mostly everybody in the book would be British. Um, and I thought, man, I'd have a hard time capturing sort of the colloquial British voice. And I wonder, is there a colloquial Canadian voice that is different from the colloquial American voice? And do you take that into account as you write your Luke Fisher stories?
Yeah, that's like another great story. That's a great question because like I was raised on American crime fiction in film,
Hmm.
and Canada doesn't really even have an imprint on any of the publishers that do crime fiction. That doesn't mean there's not great crime fiction writers like Louise Penny, who is internationally known, writes some great crime fiction. They're more what's called cozies, although I don't particularly like that name. She writes about a town called Three Pines, population 400, where there's a murder every week, which I think
Yeah,
that's pretty like
I
a lot
think
of dead
that's
people in that town.
obviously.
So it's like, is there this kind of Canadian voice? And I'm kind of a bad one to ask because um, so raised on the kind of stuff I saw, notably in 70s crime fiction, and loving that. And actually, and I said this on Twitter the other day, I just started rewatching the Rockford Files.
Mhm.
And somebody told me in a review that Luke Fisher sounds a little bit like Rockford sometime. I hadn't seen Rockford for 10 or 15 years. So my wife and I watched an episode last night and I said, holy crap, he sounds like Fisher. And there's like so much in his cadence and his smart assery. I was like, I don't even know that was rolling around in my head kind of thing. So it's sort of
Mhm.
like, is there this kind of voice? There probably is. Agents that thought about signing Fisher but eventually passed on it, they called Fisher's voice very bookish. very kind
Hmm.
of intellectual and bookish, which was surprising to me. It wasn't set out to be that way. And I don't think bookish is Canadian either. You read somebody like James Lee Burke, who I'm a huge fan of, his work is totally literary and poetic, and he just happens to write crime fiction.
Hmm.
So I don't know. It's a really good question that I think about. The last book, 3 Minute Hero, which was published, almost all takes place in Canada, and there's Canadian character actors in there. But the Canadian character actors, see, I even talk about like film. They sound kind of like the actors that were in Michigan as well. Like or
Yeah.
when I'm driving through, the Terlsons came from Norway to Wisconsin. That's where we
Hmm.
settled, right? So that's sort of like that Midwestern Scandinavian thing. I know that kind of stuff. So, but before I go on, I just want to say a couple things about Trang, okay? Because I
Yeah.
because we're talking about voice here. I don't know how he knows the shit he knows because I'm currently reading his novel, and just like what you said, how does he capture this American voice? How does he capture the streets of LA and all this kind of stuff? I'm just like,
I was very impressed. I thought he was from LA.
I did
I was
too.
really shocked. I was
And
really
then
shocked.
he comes on your show and he has a British accent. And I'm like, what? So I got a theory. Trang is a spy.
Oh,
Okay.
you think so?
I do. And I've told him
Yeah.
this because I said, where do you live? He says, oh, well, it's like, you know, Australia and the States and Singapore and the UK. And I think he does something like manufacturing and shipping, which is totally what James Bond would say, right?
Yes.
It's a total just fake thing. I don't, he's a man of the world and that's what he can write.
Yes.
I'm being silly. He's a great writer. And as I get to know him more and more, I love what he's doing. But because we're talking about voice, I'm really intrigued about his voice in that. And I'm actually scared sometimes to write. I was scared to write in the book Manastique, book 2 of the Luke Fisher series. I was scared to write about Upper Michigan because
Hmm.
I've been there a lot. And it's one of my favorite states, the UP. But could I capture it? And I'm a big researcher, and I had to really dig deep into like, I don't want to say something that's stupid you
Yeah.
know. And so I drove down. This is really funny. I drove down to the UP by myself. My wife didn't want to go. So they asked her, where's Craig? Well, he drove to Upper Michigan. And I was like, why? Because he's researching a book. And I spent about a week in Manistee, which is a town on the edge of Lake Michigan. And I talked to the locals. And I wanted to really learn about what's the difference between a sheriff and a state police and a ranger. And there's all these things that are just all these levels of law enforcement that I don't understand. And I got in a couple of really good bar conversations and I felt
Yep.
really good about, came back, made all kinds of notes. I said, yeah, but I want some good slang. What's the slang? So I'm traveling the East Coast a few years back of Canada. And I stayed in an Airbnb with a couple of people from Upper Michigan and they start talking and I'm just listening and I couldn't believe it. They got terms of derision for people who live in different parts of the state. And one of them, oh, he's a real apple knocker. I was like, what? An apple knocker. That's in Manistee because I could not leave that one alone. And it was
Yeah.
like they talk about these people, and so I love finding that kind of stuff. Now, when I write about Saskatchewan, I can just go there. I can write about Canada, no problem. Like in
Yep.
my bio, it says that stuff I grew up around. A lot of characters in the prairies, but voice is really important. Whether that's Canadian voice, but authentic voice is something I try really hard at.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. My experience with Canada is actually a little different because, of course, if I'm dealing with Canadians as a kid or in my teenage years, I haven't been back since I was in college. I'm dealing with the Quebecois or Newfies,
Oh,
who have a colloquial that no one can understand.
not even Canadian.
So yeah, so my sort of the idea of the Canadian Plains or Western Canada, I have really no experience with. So it's interesting that I think even Canada has its own different layers of um, almost. I wouldn't even. Would you say it's an ethnic? segregation or yeah, I mean, it would be ethnic because the Quebecois are Franco, uh,
Mhm.
Franco speaking. Newfies tend to be Scotch, Irish, and Dutch, and everybody else is, similar to what the American spread out along the plains, right?
Well, it's really interesting, like if it is ethnic or geographic or language, and currently it's becoming more and more political.
Yeah,
You know, and the same thing that you have, red states and blue states. The West, especially, is so conservative right now,
yeah.
and the whole province of Alberta, there's no liberals there at all. If they
Yeah.
find them, they lock them up. No, kidding.
Throw them out.
Throw them up. Hey, where did you go? Did you go to school in Canada? I just want to ask that quickly. Did
No,
you?
no, I went to a college in Worcester, Massachusetts,
Oh,
and
okay.
I'm originally from Maine.
Oh,
So Maine is the Old Orchard Beach is
yeah.
the, Jersey shore of the Quebecois.
Wow.
And so not to mention there are a lot of Franco-Americans in Maine.
Yeah, sure.
And so people say dies and dat, and then of course Newfies come down and work in northern Maine up in the county,
Yep.
and we've also got the St. Lawrence Seaway culture and the fishing culture. So I have a lot of experience with the Eastern Canada or Eastern
That's a
Canada.
very different culture. Like I traveled extensively through the East Coast a few years back, and it's just incredible culture. And it is sort of like, I mean, they talk about sometimes they talk about America being a melting pot and Canada being a mosaic, two different
Hmm.
metaphors kind of thing. But there are a lot of cultures that are happening. I mentioned the political one, but even geographically,
Yeah.
where certain people settle and stuff. I'm British Columbia, although I love Jim Gaffigan's line, there's no British there. And there's no Colombians either. I don't know why they called that, but like Eastern is its own certain culture kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there are those, and the same thing is like I've traveled a lot in the States, where you have a different culture in the Southwest as you do, because Texas is so big, Texas from West Texas to East Texas, very, very different,
Yeah.
and you got the Montana. And then I'm learning a lot about Oregon because my son-in-law is from Oregon. And
Hmm.
so that's another kind of different vibe. And we talk about Portland a lot, and Portlandia,
Oh, it's very different.
and,
Yeah.
and there's always very different, and Canada has that too, definitely these pockets. And so, in a connection to this, we were discussing the political system just last night because his sister's up from Virginia. She's from Virginia,
I
and
live in Virginia now. Yep.
yeah, you live in which part of Virginia? I don't want to
I
out you.
live outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay,
Yeah.
so she lives in Harrisonburg,
Hmm.
and we're trying to explain the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and then the three-party system. It's not a system, but it's like the liberals, the
Yeah.
conservatives, the NDP. And I'm loving that my son-in-law, who's now a Canadian citizen, is explaining this all to his sister. And then she goes, because she's very smart and very savvy. She goes, but what about Quebec, the Bloc? Because the Bloc is a huge party. It's a huge party. They have a whole bunch of seats in government.
Yeah.
And my son-in-law goes, well, that's just Quebec. That's all he says, right? I say, oh,
Yeah.
you don't need to say anything else, right?
Yeah. I was going to ask you, do they make you put 10% French language into your books before you export them? Do you have
Yeah,
to put, yeah,
it's
it's a
CanCon.
requirement.
CanCon. I'm sneaking a lot of Spanish in my books, mainly
Yeah.
because I love Mexico kind of thing. And my granddaughter, who speaks French really well, or starting to because she was in French immersion, makes such fun of my French accent that she
Yeah.
says, please don't, just don't even try. Kind of thing. But we grew up with a double-sided cereal box. That's
Yep.
what a bunch of like Canadian kids knew. One side was English and one side was French, and so that was all there. That was part of it. And so I admire that not just in Quebec, there's pockets of it too in different provinces, that they try to keep the French culture alive. I think it's
Yeah.
fantastic. There's a town called Gravelbourg in Saskatchewan that's all French, and so it sort of weaves through. And but there's other ones that are coming up, like because, say, for example, British Columbia has a very high population of people from Pakistan and East India,
Hmm.
and that's creating a different culture there. And so I guess, I can get overwhelmed by it, but I get kind of fascinated by it. That any character that comes along, because we're touching on this, I try to really make them as authentic as I can.
Yeah.
Because you said earlier about how difficult it would be to capture, like, say, the British voice. That
Yeah.
would terrify me too. I can connect to a UP voice because I've been around that, and I'm around Montana voices and stuff. But there's a big thing about what's it called? Cultural appropriation, which is the writer's minefield. Who can I write about? And I did want to mention that because it's really tough, because if I only really wrote out of my own whatever purview, it'd be like, okay, I can write white older guy
Graphic designer.
designer, cisgendered, whatever, and that'd be it. And those would be the most boring stories ever.
Yes.
So I start writing. I start writing this book, Samurai Bluegrass,
Yeah.
which took a really long time. Like Samurai Bluegrass took 9 years to write, and cultural appropriation. I think, though I see it in the States too, the minefield of cultural appropriation is big in Canada. You have to be careful who you decide to write about. And so I go, okay, so I've written this book with a Japanese um, main character. Whoops. Then, oh, that's okay. The other main character is a single mom. Oh,
Yeah.
jeez. You know, and I was like, what have I done? Kind of thing. But I tried really hard I just did so much research on Japan and Japanese history that doesn't
Yeah.
even make it in the book. And then I talked to this was the where it gets a little bit weird, in the way that it was sensitive. People said we should have a sensitivity reader, and which is a thing now,
Hmm.
and I was like, oh geez, do I have to really? I have one Japanese colleague and she's wonderful. I'd
Yeah.
never asked her to read anything of mine ever, so I come to her and I say, could you read this book? It has a Japanese main character. And right away I apologized. I'm sorry for asking you this. And she said, yeah, I'll love to read that. Can you read my book? The main character is a white red-haired male from Canada. And could you read? I'm not even making this up. And I said, oh, you want me to sensitivity read it for the heterosexual white red-haired male? Okay, I can do that.
Yes.
And it was great because she actually did point some stuff out that culturally really helped me. You know,
Well,
uh,
that's great.
that I got a deeper, what do you call it, a deeper appreciation of stuff. And so we need to do this, whether it's Canadian or American. It's always about being how it's authentic. That sounds so pie in the sky, but I hate when books feel false, right? They have,
I do too.
you know,
The my biggest sort of bugaboos and the things that really put me off, um, people who write characters dealing with substance abuse, but write it like they learned about substance abuse from a substance abuse pamphlet. You know what I mean? And it's just like, oh, I've got the symptoms of my substance abuse today. And then it's just like, no, you don't get it.
and but
That
that's what
doesn't sound authentic at all. And the other thing is um, characters who are sanctimonious, but not from a place of delusion, right? So if a character has sort of a sanctimonious personality that I view as sort of an extension of the author, and then the author being sanctimonious, but without the character having some element of delusion about them, about their values and that sort of thing, I just can't read it. I put it down and I'm just done.
Oh,
Done.
that's so perfect. It's like it's when the writer, there's so many things that pop in my head when you talk about that. John Gardner, who wrote The Art of Fiction, talks a lot about the fictional dream.
Yeah.
And when certain things come out in a book, it's like the writer's head pops up and says, by the way, this is what I think about this. That
Yeah.
sanctimonious kind of opinion,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And he says, just don't do that. It rips you right out of the fictional dream.
Oh yeah.
Just
It
as easy.
just kills the whole
Kills the whole
experience.
thing. But the worst, maybe if not the worst adage ever, it's up there for the worst adage is write what you know. Because that's just dumb.
Yeah,
because I
true.
don't know that much. But
Yeah,
it's like write what you want to know. And
yeah.
so if you're going to write something, you need to bury yourself into it to search for the authenticity we're talking about. And I'm being
Hmm.
silly about the drugs kind of stuff, but there's things about like um, detectives, um, like Luke Fisher denies that he's a detective. There's a real reason he denies that because when I started writing Luke Fisher, I said, I know nothing about detectives. How can I
Hmm.
have someone who thinks they're a PI? I know nothing. Anything I've learned is from TV, and it's
Yeah,
the same thing. It's like the pamphlet, right? The drug
yeah,
pamphlet, right? You just do tropes. So all I can do is like write a real character, but even in that is like he denies that he's a detective,
yeah.
and for that reason. And someone I'll say, someone read the first Fisher book and they asked me, "Did you get into a lot of fights?" You know, no, I'm a peace loving person. I know how to fight. I'm not very good at it. But again, anything you have to make it feel authentic, right?
Yeah.
Dads like, let's return to the theme of the show, Dan. Dads like authenticity. Don't
They
give me
do like
don't give me
authenticity.
fake stuff. I want the real.
No, no. It. Yeah, I'm thinking about the underlying element of, because of course, dadlit is a concept that I chose to define to my agent as what my books are.
Great.
I basically just told her that, you know, my books are dad lit. They're about being a dad.
Yep.
They are written in a way that I believe appeals to dads. They've got, sort of a sense of humor about them. They have caustic elements that, don't necessarily sit well with your average, Babysitter's Club reader. And to that extent, I owned up to it. At the same time, you talk about tropes, and tropes drive me insane. I find them trying, because people tell you that in order to write within a certain genre, you need to have the tropes there. And I say, yeah, but then I'm just writing the same book that everybody else has already written. That's insanely boring. Who wants to read that book over and over and over again?
Exactly. I think it's to be aware of the tropes. And by the way, I mean, I always say I'm forever behind in my reading, but what I've read of your stuff, I really love. And you have this exactly what you're talking about, this kind of caustic undertone of what's happening and stuff, and I really vibe with that. And
Mm,
I think that we can be aware of the tropes. And that's why I mentioned Megan Abbott earlier, because she reinvented the tropes. It's like you take the tropes and turn them on their head. So it's to
yeah,
kind of be aware of it just so you're not writing cliche. And I don't on purpose avoid the tropes. I said I accidentally became a crime writer. I didn't even know what the tropes were,
yeah,
and so it's exploring that kind of stuff, but always looking for something fresh. And where I am now as a writer, where I'm thankfully at, is I have the confidence to just write the stuff I want to write. Because I was also kind of saying, well, what do people read and how do I get this published and da 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 da,
yeah,
right? And that's why, hats off to all the people, mainly because he's got to be listening, Thomas Trang, making me read Williford. Because when I started to read Charles Williford, I had no idea. I'd never felt so much in common with another writer before in my life. I'm like Williford's reading my mail, or I'm reading his mail, because it was
mm,
such in sync. And he went on tangents about who knows what, and he had the confidence to do that because that's just what he's doing. And increasingly, as I write, that's what I'm doing. I'm just going to write what I want to write, and
yeah,
but it's taken me a while to get there. And I try to avoid the tropes now that I know what they are. But a way to avoid the tropes is make something really real. If you
yeah,
make something really authentic, what's it like to shoot another person? I've fired guns. I've, of course, never fired it at a person, but could you actually get into the real authenticity of what it is to take another human life? And that's getting real. And some
yeah,
tropes just avoid that. Some
hmm,
say, it's blam, 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 and they're off kind of thing, right? And
yeah,
I try to get really real, whether that's with Fisher or the samurai bluegrass story or anything. I try to dip into that authenticity because it's one of the reasons I write.
Hmm. Yeah, that comes up a lot in my
We
writing.
were we were going to talk about something we forgot to talk about,
What
because you
was it?
mentioned when you said your agent, we were going to talk about independent publishing.
Yeah, so tell me about your independent publishing process.
Yeah. Um, I'll try to give an abbreviated version of this.
Okay.
I got an agent. Took me 7 years to get a really good agent. I had a really good agent. The book went on submission. The book never sold.
Yeah.
Many other agents were interested. I dallied with some different ones, some high end ones and some low end ones, whatever like that. And eventually I got to a place where I go, like, there's something I'm doing that it's fascinating to me that you told your agent that you're writing dad lit. There's something that I'm doing that agent, I should have used that line, that agents couldn't sell my work.
Yeah.
They couldn't, there was no audience for it. And so I felt pretty depressed about that, actually. And so when I wrote Fisher, I mean, I put Correction Line out, my first novel, as a self-published book. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But I
Hmm.
wrote Fisher and I said, well, I'll put this out there and then people can read it. And then I started to learn the business of
Yeah.
self-publishing, because to do it right, you become a small publisher. And I'm thankfully I have some skills in my back pocket. I'm a graphic designer is my day job. I'm an illustrator. That was my day job for 26 years. I know how to do layout. I know how to do these things. I know how to market. Marketing is part of my job too. And if you don't know how to do this stuff, you have to put together a team of people
Yeah.
to do. And I try my very best to put out books that can sit on the shelf very easily next to traditional big five publishers. So much so that when a book of mine gets nominated for an award, like Manastika nominated for an award, when it came out, nobody knew it was self-published. And everyone else in the awards, including my category, were published by traditional publishers. And I said, good,
Hmm.
because there's still that stigma. Now, I have dabbled still. Samurai Bluegrass is published by a wonderful publisher out of Colorado called Literary Wanderlust. Great people there, and but it's different because now I don't have control when it's with them,
Yeah.
and I think I've really enjoyed the control of my own books. But it's a shit ton of work. It's so much
Oh
work,
yeah, it looks like a lot
to
of
do it.
work.
Writing is one thing, and if you don't have the skill set, or B, the wallet to bring this team together, I'm not going to say don't do it, but the product is not going to be that good. You
Yeah.
really need editors, you need designers, you need people to put together a professional package that people want to spend money on and read.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Turley. I think we've reached our hour. Do you want to plug anything before we close off on this episode of the Dadlit Pod?
I want to plug the Dad Lit podcast.
Well,
Uh,
thank you. That's nice.
because I think it's just so fun to be here and get chatting with you. We should do this more often. We don't have to have a podcast.
I
We just
know we could just hang out.
Mhm.
I was telling my wife it was so much fun to get to talk to Thomas,
Right?
and I feel I was like, yeah, maybe Thomas and I will talk, normally.
Well, yeah, and I'm loving talking to you about this kind of stuff. I know we're getting blah 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 about writing and publishing and stuff, but it's just great to
Yeah.
just shoot it too. And I guess as far as like what I want to plug is I am working on, and it's getting close to publication date, the fourth book in the Luke Fisher series. And it's called Sayulita Sucker, which my grandson, who I promised I would mention him on this podcast, his name's Jacob. And Jacob is too young. He's just going to turn 10 years old. He can't read my books because they're too adult, but he wants me
Yeah.
to tell them all the plot lines. And his favorite book so far is Sayulita Sucker because he loves saying the word sucker. And it's a fun one. It's fun and it's dark. Welcome to the stuff I write. And so it all takes place in Mexico. And it's Luke. It's going to happen probably in April, May. People are waiting for it, which really excites me. And so that's the next thing that'll be coming out for me. And I'm all over social media, so people will know that it's coming out. So that's the only plug I got.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you again, Turley. That's Craig Terlson and the Luke Fisher series. And Samurai Bluegrass. Did I get it right?
Got it right that time. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I got it right this time.
Available wherever you get books.
Available wherever you get books.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been the Dad Lit Pod.